silk was the Gilded Age's most convincing lie. It caught the light and promised purity, refinement, and effortless wealth. But every shimmering fold concealed a chain of discomforts polite society refused to name. Behind the rustle of skirts and the admiration of ballrooms were scorched hands, poisoned air, exhausted bodies, and fortunes sustained by invisible strain. Fashion did not simply dress the era, it disciplined it, rewarding beauty while quietly demanding endurance from those never invited to be seen. If you're drawn to the stories history preferred to soften or hide, take a moment to like this video, subscribe, and tell me where you're watching from. Now, step past the silk's surface and into what it truly cost. Silk entered a room ahead of its wearer. Long before a voice was raised in greeting or a gloved hand extended in courtesy, the fabric had already announced its verdict. It caught gaslight and bent it, softened movement, and signaled a particular familiarity with privilege that required no explanation. In the Gilded Age, silk did not merely clothe the body, it interpreted it for others. To wear it was to participate in a silent conversation about refinement, security, and belonging. This language of fabric was widely understood, though rarely articulated. Silk implied leisure, or at least the convincing imitation of it. It suggested that the wearer need not labor with their hands, that their days were arranged around appearances rather than exertion. Even when worn by those whose fortunes were new or precarious, silk worked as a form of social translation, smoothing rough edges and lending credibility to ambition. It was persuasive in its quietness, authoritative in its sheen. The power of silk lay in its subtlety. Unlike jewels, which declared wealth loudly, silk functioned as an assumption rather than a boast. It was woven into gowns that moved with studied restraint, into cravats and waistcoats that suggested composure and control. It asked not to be admired directly, but to be noticed indirectly, folded into the broader impression of good breeding. In this way, silk trained observers to read surfaces carefully while discouraging deeper inquiry. What made this possible was the collective agreement to treat the fabric as self-originating. Silk appeared in shops and wardrobes as if it had always existed in its finished state, smooth, luminous, obedient. The steps between raw fiber and polished garment were rarely considered relevant to polite conversation. To ask where silk came from or how it was produced risked disrupting the illusion that elegance was effortless. The fabric's authority depended on this omission. Yet silk was demanding even in its final form. It responded poorly to heat, moisture, and strain. It required careful handling, careful storage, careful wearing. The body beneath it was expected to adapt, to move less abruptly, to sit more upright, to endure warmth and restriction without visible discomfort. In this sense, silk disciplined its wearer as much as it elevated them. Grace was not optional, it was enforced by the garment itself. This discipline extended beyond posture into behavior. Silk was unforgiving of haste, clumsiness, or excess. A torn seam or dulled surface reflected not only wear, but moral failure, a suggestion of carelessness, perhaps even vulgarity. Those who wore silk learned quickly to manage themselves in accordance with its limitations. The fabric rewarded control and punished neglect, reinforcing the broader social codes of restraint that defined respectable life. What remained unspoken was that this elegance was cumulative. Each smooth surface relied on countless earlier acts of handling, pressing, dyeing, and finishing, acts that absorbed heat, strain, and risk elsewhere. Silk's ability to speak so confidently in drawing rooms depended on its silence about everything that preceded them. It asked to be read, not questioned. In this way, silk became a kind of social shorthand. It reduced complex systems of trade, labor, and exposure into a single visual cue. To see silk was to accept a conclusion without reviewing the evidence. The fabric did not lie outright. It simply omitted. And in an age that prized appearances as proof of character, omission proved remarkably effective. Thus, silk spoke first, and most listened. Silk did its most persuasive work in motion. At rest it was handsome. When moving, it became instructive. Gaslight slid across its surface and broke into softened highlights, turning ordinary gestures into rehearsed performances. A turn of the head, a rise from a chair, the careful crossing of a room, all were translated by the fabric into something deliberate and composed. Silk did not merely reflect light, it arranged it, guiding the eye toward calmness and control. This choreography was not accidental. The cut of silk garments, the weight of the weave, and the way the fabric responded to air were all designed to encourage a certain tempo of living. Quick movements wrinkled it. Sudden gestures disrupted its line. To wear silk well was to move as though one had nothing urgent to do. Leisure, whether genuine or feigned, was stitched into every fold. The fabric rewarded slowness and punished haste, quietly shaping behavior without instruction. Observers understood this language intuitively. A silk gown that glided without disturbance suggested a household free from disruption, a life insulated from necessity. Even modest movements, lifting a teacup, adjusting a sleeve, became evidence of internal discipline. The wearer appeared measured, dependable, morally sound. Silk, in this sense, acted as a visual guarantee. It reassured onlookers that the person before them possessed not only taste, but the temperament required to maintain it. Light amplified this effect. Under chandeliers and wall sconces, silk absorbed brightness and returned it softened, never harsh. It avoided glare. It seemed to belong naturally to illuminated spaces, as though it had been made for evenings rather than daylight. This harmony between fabric and setting reinforced the idea that such garments and the people wearing them were meant for refinement rather than labor. Workrooms required sturdier materials. Parlors demanded silk. The moral signaling embedded in this display was subtle, but firm. To appear unruffled in silk was to suggest self-mastery. Wrinkles implied agitation. Stains suggested negligence. The fabric therefore imposed an ongoing test. Maintaining its smoothness required foresight, restraint, and constant vigilance, qualities celebrated as virtues in polite society. Silk transformed these abstract ideals into visible markers, allowing character to be judged at a glance. This system benefited from its apparent neutrality. Silk did not announce moral judgment, it invited it. Those who read its signals believed themselves perceptive rather than instructed. They praised elegance as if it were innate, ignoring the labor of compliance required to sustain it. In doing so, they reinforced a hierarchy that favored those able or compelled to conform to the fabric's demands. What made this signaling particularly effective was its deniability. No one openly claimed that silk proved virtue. Yet patterns of trust, invitation, and inclusion followed its presence with remarkable consistency. Silk wearers were assumed to be careful with more than fabric. They were expected to manage households, finances, and reputations with the same gentle precision. The garment became a proxy for moral reliability. Meanwhile, the body inside the silk learned to anticipate scrutiny. Posture adjusted, movements softened, breath shortened to avoid strain on seams. Over time, these accommodations felt natural, even necessary. Silk taught its wearers how to inhabit respectability, turning discipline into habit and habit into identity. Thus, light and movement combined to elevate silk beyond material. It became an instrument through which society read virtue, not by listening, but by watching. And in this quiet exchange between fabric and gaze, moral worth was continually rehearsed, never spoken, never questioned, and rarely earned without cost. Silk did more than decorate the body, it protected it. Not from cold or injury, but from judgment. In a society attentive to surfaces, the fabric became a form of armor, lightweight, flexible, and remarkably effective. It shielded its wearer from suspicion, smoothing first impressions and deflecting questions before they could fully form. Where silk appeared, doubt often receded. This protection was most valuable in spaces governed by observation rather than intimacy. In parlors, theaters, and dining rooms, individuals were rarely known deeply. They were assessed instead through posture, tone, and dress. Silk functioned as an advanced defense in these encounters. It announced conformity to shared expectations, signaling that the wearer understood the rules and could be trusted to follow them. The fabric stood between the person and the possibility of misinterpretation. Such armor was especially important for those navigating uncertain social ground. New money, recent arrivals, or families recovering from quiet misfortune relied on silk to stabilize perception. A well-chosen gown or waistcoat could momentarily erase ambiguity, allowing its wearer to pass unchallenged. Silk didn't grant permanent security, but it offered a temporary shield, often long enough to establish acceptance. This protection, however, was conditional. Silk required maintenance, vigilance, and continual renewal. Its surface was easily marred, and damage was rarely forgiven. A snag or frayed edge suggested neglect, perhaps even decline. The armor worked only so long as it appeared intact. In this way, silk imposed a constant state of alertness. To remain protected, one had to remain careful. The psychological effect of this arrangement was subtle but persistent. Wearers became attuned to their own vulnerability, aware that their social standing rested on the preservation of an exterior. Silk encouraged inward restraint. Laughter softened, gestures minimized, even emotion was moderated, lest it disrupt the fabric's composure. The armor demanded discipline from within. At the same time, silk created distance. It separated the wearer from others not similarly clad, reinforcing distinctions that went unspoken, but clearly felt. Cotton and wool signaled usefulness. Silk suggested exemption from necessity. This separation allowed wearers to move through social spaces with reduced exposure, protected not only from judgment, but from unwanted familiarity. Silk invited admiration, not approach. Yet this armor was unevenly distributed. Not everyone could afford its protection, and those who produced it were rarely permitted to benefit from it. The fabric's role as shield depended on the invisibility of those who handled it earlier in its life. Their labor fortified others while leaving themselves exposed. Silk defended selectively. Over time, the armor hardened into expectation. Those accustomed to its protection came to rely on it, feeling oddly diminished without it. To appear in lesser fabric was to feel suddenly visible, vulnerable, unguarded. Silk thus trained dependency. It taught wearers to equate safety with appearance, reassurance with sheen. In this way, silk did not merely shield individuals, it reinforced the structure of society itself. It protected existing hierarchies by making them feel natural, even comforting. The armor was light enough to forget, flexible enough to admire, and strong enough to deflect scrutiny. And as long as it remained admired rather than examined, it continued to serve its purpose, quietly, effectively, and at a cost borne elsewhere. Silk carried weight in ways rarely acknowledged. Though praised for its lightness and fluidity, the fabric imposed a steady pressure, physical, social, and psychological, upon those who wore it. This weight was not measured in pounds, but in endurance. It pressed inward, shaping posture, limiting breath, and reminding the body at every moment of its obligation to appear unburdened. Gilded Age silk garments were engineered to suggest ease while demanding restraint. Layers accumulated quietly. Underskirts, linings, facings, and fastenings, each adding substance beneath the illusion of delicacy. The result was a garment that moved gracefully only when the wearer complied with its conditions. To sit required planning. To stand required care. To bend was often discouraged entirely. The body learned quickly where it was permitted to go and where it was not. This tyranny was quiet because it masqueraded as refinement. Discomfort was reframed as composure. Strain became grace. The ability to endure without visible complaint was treated as evidence of character. In this way, silk did not merely adorn the body, it instructed it. It taught wearers to internalize limitation, to accept restriction as natural, even desirable. The fabric's weight became a lesson absorbed through repetition. Breath was among the first concessions. Bodices and waist seams narrowed the torso, encouraging shallow inhalation and measured speech. Deep breaths distorted the line of the garment. Laughter had to be restrained. Emotion itself became subject to the cut of the dress. The body adapted by becoming smaller, quieter, more contained. Silk rewarded those who learned this lesson well. Heat compounded the effect. Silk trapped warmth, especially under gaslight and within crowded rooms. Perspiration threatened stains and damage, yet relief required movement, precisely what the garment discouraged. Wearers were expected to endure rising temperature with composure intact. The absence of complaint was not accidental, it was trained. Fashion demanded silence as part of its cost. This burden was unevenly distributed. Women bore it most visibly, though men, too, experienced its discipline through tailored silk waistcoats and cravats that constrained posture and neck. For women, however, the expectation was relentless. To carry the weight elegantly was to prove worthiness. Failure invited judgment, not sympathy. The tyranny was reinforced socially, not imposed by decree. Over time, the body ceased to protest loudly. Muscles adjusted. Breathing patterns changed. Discomfort became familiar, then unremarkable. This adaptation was often praised as maturity or poise, when in truth it reflected prolonged negotiation between flesh and fabric. Silk did not break its wearers, it trained them. What made this tyranny particularly effective was its invisibility. Observers saw only the result, a composed figure moving with apparent ease. The effort beneath remained concealed, folded into the garment's structure. To acknowledge the weight would have disrupted the illusion, and so it went unnamed. Thus, silk ruled gently but persistently. Its authority was not enforced through spectacle, but through daily accommodation. The fabric asked for endurance, and society rewarded those who complied. In this quiet exchange, fashionable weight became a measure of virtue, and the cost of bearing it was accepted as the price of belonging. Silk arrived already absolved. By the time it appeared in shop windows and wardrobes, it had traveled far enough to seem detached from consequence. Distance softened responsibility. What came from elsewhere, across oceans, borders, and intermediary hands, felt removed from the moral landscape of the parlor. The fabric's foreignness did not trouble conscience, it reassured it. In the Gilded Age, importation itself functioned as a kind of purification. Goods that arrived by ship carried with them an assumption of inevitability, as though their existence were the natural outcome of commerce rather than the result of human effort. Silk was discussed in terms of quality and origin, China, France, Italy, but rarely in terms of process. Geography replaced labor in conversation. The farther the source, the easier it became not to imagine the journey. This distance fostered a particular kind of blindness. Local industries, when they faltered, were visible. Strikes, illness, accidents, these could sometimes be witnessed, even if politely ignored. Imported silk, however, arrived intact and untroubled, its prior handling erased by miles of separation. Whatever discomfort attended its production was assumed to belong to another world, governed by different rules and expectations. It was not cruelty, but convenience that sustained this belief. Merchants encouraged the illusion. Advertising emphasized romance and refinement, invoking ancient traditions and artisanal mastery without acknowledging the conditions that made volume and speed possible. Silk was framed as timeless rather than timely, as if unchanged by the pressures of modern demand. The fabric's past was rendered decorative, an abstract story rather than a lived experience. Consumers participated willingly. To inquire too closely risked discomfort, and discomfort had no place in luxury. The enjoyment of silk depended on a certain ignorance, carefully maintained. Polite society learned to accept the finished object without curiosity, treating inquiry as a breach of taste. Silence became a marker of refinement. This blindness was not total. It was selective. People were capable of moral concern when proximity demanded it, but imported goods offered plausible deniability. Responsibility dissolved across distance. If harm existed, it was assumed to be either exaggerated or unavoidable. The silk in one's hands felt real. Whatever lay behind it felt theoretical. Local blindness also operated temporally. By the time silk reached its wearer, the labor that produced it had already occurred. Pain, if present, was safely in the past. The present moment, the sheen, the admiration, the social ease, felt untainted. The fabric's ability to function socially depended on this separation of time as much as place. This arrangement benefited all who wished not to see. Wearers enjoyed the rewards of luxury without confronting its origins. Society preserved its image of progress unburdened by visible cost. Silk moved through rooms as a symbol of success, never as evidence. Yet blindness has limits. It requires constant reinforcement. The more silk circulated, the more elaborate the justifications became. Distance had to be emphasized, processes obscured, questions discouraged. Local blindness was not passive, it was maintained. Thus, imported luxury trained society to look elsewhere, to admire what arrived and forget how it came. Silk perfected this lesson. It taught that beauty could be separated from burden, that elegance could exist without context. And in accepting this lesson, Gilded Age society learned not merely to wear silk, but to look away. The ballroom was designed to persuade. Its mirrors multiplied light, its polished floors invited movement, and its music softened the passage of hours. To enter such a space in silk was to participate in a carefully arranged fiction, one in which pleasure appeared effortless and fatigue was politely denied. Yet beneath the chandeliers, endurance was the unspoken requirement. Silk performed best in these rooms precisely because the environment concealed its demands. Gaslight blurred edges and warmed colors, disguising strain beneath glow. Music provided rhythm, allowing movement to appear fluid even when it was carefully controlled. Conversation filled silences that might otherwise have revealed discomfort. The ballroom did not erase effort, it distracted from it. For those wearing silk, the evening began long before arrival. Dressing required assistance, adjustment, and patience. Once secured, the garment imposed its conditions. Posture had to be maintained, steps measured, gestures rehearsed. The body entered the room already disciplined, prepared to endure without acknowledgement. What followed was less celebration than performance. Dancing intensified the demand. Silk gowns, layered and weighted, responded poorly to exertion. Movement had to be elegant rather than energetic. Partners navigated space with caution, mindful of hems and seams. A misstep risked damage, not only to fabric, but to reputation. The dance floor became a test of control, where endurance masqueraded as grace. Heat accumulated steadily. Crowded rooms trapped warmth, and silk retained it. Perspiration threatened stains and discomfort, yet relief was constrained. Gloves remained on. Corsetry held firm. Fans offered modest reprieve, more symbolic than effective. To show distress was to break character. Endurance was expected, admired, and never discussed. Observers rarely noticed the cost. They saw only the surface, composed expressions, steady movement, luminous fabric catching the light. Compliments rewarded appearance, not effort. The wearer learned that endurance, when properly concealed, generated admiration. This reinforced the cycle. Discomfort became an investment, paid quietly for social return. The ballroom thus functioned as a proving ground. It sorted participants not by wealth alone, but by their ability to sustain illusion. Those who faltered, who grew visibly tired, overheated, or strained, were gently marginalized. The room rewarded those who could endure longest without betraying it. This expectation extended beyond the individual. Entire households participated in the performance. Servants managed climate and refreshments, smoothing the experience for guests while remaining unseen. The success of the evening depended on coordinated endurance, distributed unevenly and acknowledged scarcely at all. By night's end, silk bore subtle traces of the trial, creased linings, loosened threads, fatigue held in the body beneath. Yet these signs remained private. The public memory preserved only the impression. Elegance achieved, society affirmed. The endurance that made it possible dissolved into silence. Thus, the ballroom perfected silk's role. It transformed effort into spectacle while concealing its cost. In doing so, it taught an enduring lesson that beauty, properly staged, could demand much and confess nothing. Delicacy, once a private condition, became a public aspiration. In the Gilded Age, fragility was not merely tolerated, it was curated. Silk played a central role in this transformation, lending its softness and sheen to an ideal that prized weakness presented as refinement. To appear easily fatigued, narrowly built, or physically slight was no longer a cause for concern. It was evidence of distinction. Silk encouraged this aesthetic quietly but persistently. Its fine threads clung to narrow frames and emphasized restraint rather than strength. Garments were designed to hang, drape, and glide, not to support movement or exertion. The body beneath was expected to recede, to become a structure upon which the fabric could perform. In this arrangement, vitality was less valued than manageability. Society read this fragility as moral proof. A delicate appearance suggested exemption from labor and distance from necessity. It implied protection, often by wealth, sometimes by marriage, always by circumstance. Silk amplified this impression. It softened outlines and muted signs of physical power. Muscles disappeared beneath layers that discouraged their use. The resulting figure appeared cultivated rather than capable. This ideal was reinforced through language and praise. Women described as slight, pale, or easily tired were admired for their refinement. Men whose clothing emphasized narrowness and restraint were credited with seriousness and intellect. Silk provided the visual vocabulary for these judgments, allowing fragility to be admired without being named. The body adapted accordingly. Appetite was moderated, movement minimized. Health became something to be preserved by avoidance rather than strength. To endure discomfort silently was considered graceful, while visible resilience risked appearing coarse. Silk rewarded those who conformed by enhancing their appearance, making fragility seem natural rather than imposed. This fashion carried consequences that were seldom addressed directly. Physical weakness, once aestheticized, was easily ignored. Faintness was excused. Chronic discomfort normalized. The line between elegance and illness blurred, yet few were willing to redraw it. Silk smoothed over the distinction, offering beauty as compensation. Medical opinion occasionally raised concern, but these voices struggled against a culture invested in appearance. Doctors warned of restricted breathing, poor circulation, and exhaustion. Yet their observations conflicted with admired ideals. To challenge silk was to challenge refinement itself. As long as fragility remained fashionable, warnings remained secondary. The appeal of this aesthetic lay in its exclusivity. Fragility suggested that one need not be strong because strength was unnecessary. It separated those who endured from those who labored. Silk marked this separation visibly, allowing bodies to declare their exemption without explanation. Thus, fragility became a performance, sustained by fabric and reinforced by admiration. Silk did not create weakness, but it elevated it, transforming limitation into virtue. In doing so, it reshaped the body not through force, but through expectation. The result was an ideal that looked effortless, felt burdensome, and was praised precisely because it appeared so easily undone. Silk promised gentleness. Its reputation rested on touch, on the idea that it soothed rather than challenged the body. Yet contact told a more complicated story. Against the skin, silk demanded negotiation. It cooled and warmed unpredictably, clung when unwelcome, and revealed the body's responses with unforgiving clarity. What appeared effortless in appearance required constant adjustment in wear. The fabric's sensitivity was its defining trait. It reacted immediately to moisture, heat, and friction. Perspiration darkened it. Oils from the skin dulled its surface. Even the faintest irregularity was recorded and displayed. To wear silk was to accept surveillance by one's own body. Every sensation became consequential. Every physical response a potential flaw. This intimacy produced discipline. Wearers learned to anticipate the fabric's reactions and to manage themselves accordingly. Movement slowed to reduce friction. Temperature was monitored with care. Personal habits adjusted to preserve the garment's surface. The body became an accessory to the fabric rather than its master, adapting itself to the demands of preservation. Comfort, when achieved, was conditional. Silk could feel cool at first contact, offering brief relief in warm rooms. But as heat accumulated, it trapped warmth close to the skin. Unlike sturdier fabrics that allowed air to circulate, silk formed a barrier that held sensation in place. Relief required removal or loosening, both of which risked disrupting appearance. Endurance remained the preferred solution. Irritation was another quiet companion. Seams pressed, edges rubbed. The fine weave that made silk desirable also made it unforgiving. Minor discomforts accumulated over hours, then normalized. The wearer learned to ignore signals that would otherwise prompt adjustment. Attention shifted outward, toward maintaining composure, rather than inward, toward bodily needs. This relationship altered perception. Sensation became something to manage privately, never to acknowledge publicly. Discomfort was reframed as part of refinement, a necessary accompaniment to elegance. Silk taught its wearers to distrust their own bodies, to treat physical responses as inconveniences rather than information. The visibility of silk intensified this lesson. Because the fabric revealed changes so readily, the body beneath was expected to remain stable. Fluctuations in temperature, emotion, or health threatened to leave marks. The pressure to remain unchanged extended beyond posture into physiology. Calmness became not only a virtue, but a necessity. For some, the fabric offered moments of genuine pleasure. Its smoothness could soothe, its drape could flatter. These moments reinforced loyalty to the garment, encouraging wearers to accept its demands. Pleasure and discomfort existed together, intertwined, making critique difficult. Silk didn't feel uniformly oppressive. It felt exacting. The intimacy between fabric and skin also reinforced separation. Those who labored could not wear silk for long without consequence. Sweat and motion betrayed them quickly. Silk thus became a marker of controlled environments and controlled bodies. Its successful wear depended on conditions unavailable to many, further narrowing its circle of acceptance. In the end, silk against the skin revealed the limits of appearance. It exposed the body's negotiation with expectation, recording each concession quietly. The fabric remained admired for its softness, while the effort required to maintain that softness went unremarked. Touch told the truth, but only to the wearer. Silk invited admiration and discouraged questions. Its success depended not on secrecy, but on a shared reluctance to look too closely. In drawing rooms and shops alike, appreciation stopped at the surface. The fabric's sheen was praised, its color discussed, its cut admired. What lay beyond these immediate qualities was considered irrelevant, even impolite. To inquire further was to risk disrupting the pleasure of recognition. This pattern was not accidental. Gilded Age society prized smooth interactions, free from friction or discomfort. Conversation favored visible qualities because they could be shared without consequence. Silk offered a safe subject. One could admire without obligation, compliment without responsibility. The fabric absorbed attentions while deflecting curiosity. Over time, this habit became reflexive. Admiration trained the eye to linger on finish rather than origin. The more silk circulated, the more normalized this selective vision became. Shops displayed bolts and garments in controlled light, emphasizing uniformity and perfection. Any irregularity was removed before display, reinforcing the impression that silk arrived complete and unquestionable. Social reinforcement played a role. Those who admired silk appropriately were rewarded with inclusion. They demonstrated taste, discernment, and alignment with shared values. Those who questioned too openly risked appearing gauche or overly earnest. Inquiry was subtly discouraged not by rule, but by reaction. Silence proved more advantageous. This dynamic extended beyond consumers to commentators. Fashion writers praised silk for its elegance and versatility, rarely addressing its production. Their language elevated the fabric into an object of culture rather than commerce. Silk was framed as artful, timeless, and refined. By placing it in this category, writers removed it from the realm of scrutiny. Admiration also functioned as reassurance. To praise silk was to affirm the system that made it available. The act of admiration suggested satisfaction, implying that all was well. In this way, appreciation served a stabilizing role. It quieted potential unease by redirecting attention toward beauty. The absence of inquiry was particularly notable given the era's fascination with progress and industry. Machines, factories, and innovation were discussed openly in other contexts. Yet silk remained curiously exempt from such interest. Its luxury status insulated it from the questions asked of lesser materials. Progress was celebrated when visible, ignored when inconvenient. This exemption allowed contradictions to coexist. Society could champion improvement while accepting harm elsewhere, provided it remained unseen. Silk thrived in this environment. Its desirability increased precisely because it asked nothing of the admirer beyond appreciation. For wearers, admiration reinforced commitment. Compliments validated endurance. Each approving glance confirmed that the effort invested in maintaining appearance was worthwhile. Inquiry would have complicated this exchange. It might have introduced doubt where reassurance was preferred. Thus, admiration became a closed circuit. Silk inspired praise. Praise discouraged questioning, and the absence of questions preserved the conditions under which silk could be enjoyed without complication. The system required no enforcement because it aligned with comfort. In this way, admiration without inquiry became a social skill. It allowed beauty to circulate freely, unburdened by context. Silk benefited from this arrangement, maintaining its authority through acceptance rather than concealment. The fabric did not hide its past. It relied on the decision not to ask. Elegance did not merely please the eye, it occupied it. In the Gilded Age, beauty functioned as a form of diversion, gently guiding attention away from what lay beneath its surface. Silk excelled at this task. Its sheen, movement, and refinement offered the mind something agreeable to rest upon, discouraging reflection beyond the visible. Elegance did not argue against scrutiny, it replaced it. The power of this distraction lay in its subtlety. Silk did not demand admiration through excess. It persuaded through harmony. Colors were chosen to flatter gaslight. Textures softened outlines. The fabric moved with the body just enough to suggest ease. Together, these qualities produced an impression of order and calm. In such an atmosphere, questions felt unnecessary, even intrusive. This effect was reinforced by setting. Silk was most often encountered in spaces already designed to soothe and impress. Drawing rooms, shops, and theaters provided controlled environments where beauty was expected and discomfort excluded. Within these spaces, elegance appeared natural, almost inevitable. The fabric belonged there. Anything that challenged this impression felt out of place. Elegance also offered emotional reassurance. In an era marked by rapid industrial change, visible refinement suggested stability. Silk garments signaled continuity, linking the present moment to established traditions of taste. This reassurance mattered. It allowed society to believe that progress had not disrupted civility, that refinement still governed daily life. Elegance smoothed over anxieties that might otherwise surface. The distraction was effective because it aligned with desire. People wanted to be reassured. They wanted beauty to mean something uncomplicated. Silk provided this simplicity. It asked only to be admired, not interpreted. In return, it offered social ease. Conversations flowed. Judgments softened. Attention settled on surfaces that promised resolution rather than complexity. For those who wore silk, elegance offered protection from reflection as well. Focus shifted outward toward maintaining appearance. Effort was spent on posture, expression, and presentation. There was little room left for contemplation of origin or consequence. The demands of elegance filled the mind, leaving deeper questions unaddressed. This was not ignorance, but deferral. Many understood, at least abstractly, that luxury carried unseen costs, yet elegance encouraged postponement. There would be time later, perhaps, to consider such matters. For now, the moment required appreciation. Silk thrived in this present tense, where beauty was immediate and context distant. The effectiveness of elegance as distraction depended on repetition. Each social encounter reinforced the habit. Each compliment confirmed that surface was sufficient. Over time, this pattern became self-sustaining. Elegance trained perception, teaching the eye where to linger and where to pass quickly. Even criticism, when it appeared, often focused on excess rather than origin. Moral unease was redirected toward fashion extremes, not toward the systems that supported them. Silk itself remained admired. Its role as distraction was preserved by adjusting style, not substance. Thus, elegance performed cultural labor. It kept attention aligned with appearance, allowing underlying structures to remain unexamined. Silk embodied this function perfectly. It offered beauty that felt complete, requiring no further thought. And as long as elegance held the gaze, silence followed naturally. In this way, silk did more than adorn the Gilded Age. It steadied it. It softened awareness, absorbed concern, and redirected curiosity toward surfaces that asked nothing back. Elegance did not hide reality. It made looking elsewhere feel unnecessary. The places where silk was finished were never meant to be remembered. They existed at the edges of cities, above shops, behind unmarked doors, and at the top of staircases that visitors were not invited to climb. Their absence from polite imagination was deliberate. The refinement displayed in public depended on the careful concealment of the spaces where that refinement was produced. Workrooms were arranged for efficiency, not comfort. Light entered where it could, often filtered through narrow windows or shared walls. Air circulated poorly. Tables were set close together, bodies aligned in rows that encouraged silence and repetition. The design was practical, but also strategic. These rooms were easy to overlook, easy to dismiss as temporary or incidental, even though they operated continuously. Silk passed through many such spaces, each one contributing an invisible step toward the finished garment. Cutting, stitching, pressing, and finishing required precision and patience. The work demanded steady hands and sustained attention. Errors were costly. Perfection was expected without delay. The environment reflected these priorities. It asked for endurance rather than ease. The location of these workrooms mattered. By placing them out of sight, society preserved the illusion that elegance emerged fully formed. The journey from raw material to polished silk was fragmented across spaces that rarely connected with one another, and never with the rooms where silk was admired. This separation allowed admiration to proceed without interruption. Those who labored within these rooms understood their invisibility. Their work was valued, but their presence was not. Recognition flowed toward the product, not the process. Success was measured by absence. If the garment appeared flawless, the room that produced it had done its job. Silence was confirmation. The design of these spaces reinforced hierarchy. Supervisors moved between tables, monitoring output. Workers remained fixed. Their bodies adapted to narrow ranges of motion. Time was divided into tasks rather than hours, encouraging focus on immediate demands rather than overall conditions. The room shaped attention inward, away from context. These environments were rarely described accurately in public discourse. When mentioned at all, they were framed as industrious or respectable. The reality was more constrained. Heat from pressing irons accumulated. Fine particles lingered in the air. Long hours blurred into one another, yet these details remained confined to the room itself. The invisibility of workrooms served multiple purposes. It spared consumers discomfort. It protected merchants from scrutiny. It allowed the narrative of elegance to remain intact. By design, these spaces absorbed strain quietly, leaving no trace on the surface of the silk they produced. Even reform efforts struggled to penetrate this separation. Inspections were infrequent. Improvements were partial. As long as the rooms remained unseen, their conditions could be minimized. Out of sight meant out of conversation. Design functioned as defense. The workers themselves learned to move between worlds without recognition. They handled luxury daily while remaining excluded from its benefits. Silk passed through their hands and left without altering their circumstances. The workroom existed as a conduit, not a destination. In this way, the hidden design of workrooms became essential to the social order surrounding silk. They were not accidental oversights. They were necessary omissions. Elegance required them to remain unseen, unnamed, and unquestioned. And so they remained, quietly sustaining a world that preferred not to know where its beauty learned to exist. The labor that refined silk relied heavily on women whose presence remained largely unacknowledged. Their work was described as suitable, delicate, and naturally aligned with feminine aptitude. These descriptions softened perception while hardening expectation. Precision was demanded, patience assumed, and endurance quietly required. The gloss admired in public was achieved through hours spent bent over fabric, eyes trained to detect imperfection, and hands conditioned to correct it. Women filled the workrooms in numbers that shaped the rhythm of production. They cut, stitched, finished, and inspected. Their tasks were divided finely, each motion repeated until it became automatic. The posture required by this work was unforgiving. Backs curved forward, shoulders tightened, neck and wrist bore the strain of prolonged focus. The body adapted not by strengthening, but by enduring. This endurance was framed as virtue. Women were praised for diligence and care, qualities that conveniently aligned with the demands placed upon them. The narrative suggested that such work was lighter, cleaner, and more appropriate than heavier trades. In practice, it was exacting in different ways. The strain was subtle, cumulative, and rarely visible to those outside the room. Silk magnified this dynamic. Its sensitivity required constant attention. A loose thread or uneven seam could diminish value. Women were expected to notice flaws before they emerged. This vigilance demanded sustained concentration under conditions that offered little relief. Breaks were brief. Errors were costly. The standard of perfection left little room for fatigue. Payment reflected neither skill nor strain. Wages were calculated to encourage speed without acknowledging toll. Many women supplemented family income through this work, their contribution essential yet undervalued. The economic necessity that drew them into workrooms was often framed as moral responsibility. Their labor was treated as extension of duty rather than profession. Visibility remained limited. While silk traveled through society, the women who shaped it remained confined to their spaces. Their connection to the final garment was severed by design. The finished piece carried no trace of their effort beyond its polish. Recognition flowed upward toward designers and merchants, leaving the hands that produced refinement unnamed. The work shaped identity as much as product. Hours spent attending to silk reinforced expectations of quietness and compliance. Conversation was secondary to output. Individuality yielded to uniform motion. Over time, the rhythm of labor imprinted itself on behavior, encouraging restraint even beyond the workroom. Health concerns surfaced slowly. Eyes strained under poor light. Fine particles irritated lungs. Repetitive motion affected joints. These issues were rarely addressed directly. Complaints risked dismissal or replacement. The workforce was assumed to be renewable. 1. Woman could be substituted for another without altering the flow of production. Society absorbed the results without reflection. Silk garments appeared pristine, reinforcing the belief that refinement emerged effortlessly. The bent posture required to produce that finish was absent from public imagination. Women remained associated with the beauty they helped create, but not with the cost of its creation. This arrangement persisted because it aligned with broader expectations. Women were expected to serve quietly, to refine without recognition, to sustain beauty without drawing attention to themselves. Silk offered a material expression of this role. Its surface was admired, its origin ignored. Thus, women bent over gloss became part of the fabric's story without being allowed to tell it. Their labor was integral yet obscured, essential yet unnamed. In their quiet endurance, silk found its final polish, and society found another way to preserve elegance without acknowledging the hands that held it steady. The refinement of silk required heat, moisture, and transformation. These elements shaped the fabric's final surface, but they also shaped the conditions of the rooms where that transformation occurred. Pressing irons, steaming vats, and chemical treatments were essential to producing the smooth finish admired in public. Their presence was constant, their effects rarely discussed. Heat dominated the workroom. Irons remained in near constant use, lifted and set down in steady rhythm. Steam rose from dampened fabric, filling the air and settling into walls and clothing. In confined spaces, temperature climbed quickly. Windows offered limited relief, often kept closed to control dust or drafts that might disturb fine work. The warmth was not seasonal, it was structural. Burns were common and accepted. Minor injuries were treated as inevitable, a cost of maintaining pace. Fingers brushed hot metal. Wrists caught escaping steam. Skin toughened in response, learning to endure brief pain without pause. These marks were seldom recorded. They faded quickly, leaving no lasting evidence, which made them easy to dismiss. chemical processes added another layer of exposure. Dyes, cleaning agents, and finishing treatments were used to achieve uniform color and sheen. Their odors lingered in the air, sharp and persistent. Ventilation was limited. Workers inhaled these fumes daily, often without clear understanding of their effects. Discomfort was immediate, consequences delayed. The combination of heat and chemical air altered the body's rhythms. Breathing shortened, throats dried. Fatigue arrived early and lingered. Yet productivity expectations remained unchanged. The environment demanded adaptation rather than accommodation. Bodies adjusted by becoming less responsive to discomfort, more tolerant of strain. Supervision focused on output. As long as silk emerged smooth and consistent, conditions were considered acceptable. Complaints were framed as weakness or distraction. The work required focus, and focus required silence. Attention was directed toward fabric, not air quality or temperature. The room trained its occupants to prioritize surface over sensation. These conditions were rarely visible to those outside. Finished garments carried no trace of steam or chemical exposure. The burn marks on hands were concealed by gloves once workers left the room. The air of refinement remained uncontaminated in public imagination. What was endured privately did not translate into narrative. Occasional concern surfaced in professional circles. Inspectors noted heat and poor ventilation. Medical observers mentioned respiratory irritation. These observations rarely resulted in meaningful change. Improvements were incremental and inconsistent. The demand for efficiency outweighed caution. Silk's value depended on speed as much as precision. Workers learned to manage exposure as best they could. Cloths were wrapped around handles. Windows were opened briefly when possible. Breaks were taken where allowed. These small adjustments mitigated discomfort without altering structure. The system remained intact. The normalization of these conditions relied on their invisibility. Burns healed. Air cleared when doors opened. No single moment demanded attention. Harm accumulated quietly, spread across time and bodies. This gradual nature made it difficult to challenge. There was no crisis, only persistence. Thus burns, steam, and chemical air became part of silk's hidden economy. They shaped the labor that produced elegance while remaining absent from its display. The fabric emerged flawless, carrying no record of the heat that smoothed it or the air that sustained it. And so the cost remained unspoken, absorbed into routine, accepted as necessary, and left behind when silk entered the world of light and admiration. Not all harm announced itself with heat or pain. Some arrived quietly, suspended in the air, invisible to the eye and easily dismissed. Silk dust was one such presence. It emerged as a byproduct of cutting, brushing, and finishing, released in fine particles that settled slowly and were breathed without notice. Its danger lay in its subtlety. It did not burn. It did not sting. It accumulated. Workrooms where silk was handled continuously developed a particular atmosphere. Light passing through the space revealed drifting motes that caught and scattered brightness. They were often described as harmless, even picturesque, evidence of industry at work. Yet these particles carried fragments of fiber, dye, and treatment residue. With each breath, they entered the body. The act of cutting silk produced the greatest volume. Shears moved swiftly across fabric, releasing fine threads that hung in the air before settling on tables, clothing, and skin. Brushing and finishing added to the haze. Over time, this dust became part of the room itself, clinging to surfaces and resuspending with movement. Ventilation, where present, was rarely sufficient to remove it entirely. Workers noticed changes gradually. A persistent dryness in the throat, a cough that lingered longer than expected, shortness of breath during tasks that once felt manageable. These symptoms were rarely dramatic. They did not interrupt work immediately. Instead, they altered endurance, making each day slightly more difficult than the last. Medical understanding of such exposure was limited and uneven. Some physicians recognized a connection between textile dust and respiratory irritation, but these observations struggled to gain traction. The effects were slow and diffuse, difficult to attribute to a single cause. Workers moved between rooms and employments. Illness blended into fatigue. The dust remained unnamed in most discussions. Employers often regarded the issue as unavoidable. Dust was framed as an inherent feature of textile work, no more remarkable than thread or cloth. Remedies focused on cleanliness rather than prevention. Floors were swept, tables wiped. These measures redistributed particles without removing them. The underlying conditions persisted. For workers, adaptation became the primary response. Scarves were tied loosely around mouths. Windows were opened when weather permitted. Breaks were taken outside if possible. These small acts provided temporary relief without challenging the system that produced the dust. Silence remained the safer option. The invisibility of the harm contributed to its endurance. Unlike burns or visible injury, respiratory effects left no immediate mark. Workers could continue to function, albeit with diminished capacity. This allowed production to proceed uninterrupted. The cost was deferred, borne over years rather than hours. Silk dust also benefited from contrast. Compared to the filth and danger associated with heavier industries, silkwork appeared clean. The absence of grime created a false sense of safety. The air looked clear. The rooms were orderly. The threat did not match expectation, and so it was overlooked. Outside the workroom, the issue vanished entirely. Finished garments carried no trace of dust. Their surfaces were smooth, their appearance pristine. Consumers encountered silk only in its final state, reinforcing the belief that its production was gentle and refined. The air of the workroom remained confined to those who breathed it daily. Thus, silk dust became one of the quietest costs of elegance. It moved unseen, entered unnoticed, and altered lives gradually. It left no dramatic record, no singular moment of reckoning. Instead, it settled into lungs and routines alike, an unacknowledged companion to the fabric's journey. The sheen admired in public depended in part on this invisible residue, absorbed and endured without recognition. Small hands were considered an advantage. In the silk trade, delicacy was prized, and children were thought especially suited to tasks requiring fine control and sustained attention. This belief shaped the composition of many workrooms, where young bodies moved among tables and machines with practiced familiarity. Their presence was explained as apprenticeship or assistance, framed as preparation rather than exploitation. Children entered these spaces early. Some followed parents already employed there. Others were placed through arrangements that blended necessity with expectation. Their work was described as light and appropriate, a contrast to the heavier labor found elsewhere. This language obscured reality. The tasks assigned to children demanded precision, patience, and long hours of repetition. The strain was subtle but persistent. Silk required careful handling at every stage. Threads were sorted, edges trimmed, seams checked for irregularity. These tasks suited smaller fingers and keen eyesight, but they also required stillness. Children stood or sat for extended periods, their posture shaped by tables set for adult bodies. Fatigue arrived quickly, but expectation did not adjust. Output remained the measure of value. The environment offered little accommodation for youth. Heat from pressing irons and steam vats affected everyone equally. Dust and chemical air did not discriminate by age. Yet children had fewer reserves. Their bodies absorbed strain more deeply, adapting in ways that would reveal consequences later. Growth occurred alongside exposure, entwining development with endurance. Education, when present, was secondary. Work took precedence over schooling, framed as responsibility or contribution. Time spent in the workroom was justified as productive and moral. Idleness was viewed with suspicion. Industry, even at a young age, was praised as character forming. The cost of this formation was rarely examined. Supervision emphasized obedience. Children were expected to learn quickly and remain quiet. Mistakes were corrected sharply. The pace allowed little room for distraction. Over time, this environment trained compliance. The habits formed there extended beyond the workroom, shaping demeanor and expectation. Silence became a skill. Visibility remained limited. Children working with silk did not fit the popular image of industrial labor. Their tasks appeared clean and controlled. This made concern easier to dismiss. Compared to factory floors or mines, silk work seemed benign. The delicate nature of the trade softened perception, masking the cumulative effects on young bodies. Families often depended on this income. The contribution of children helped stabilize household finances. This necessity complicated resistance. To question the practice was to question survival. Employers benefited from this arrangement, gaining reliable labor at lower cost. The system sustained itself through shared constraint. Occasional reform efforts acknowledged the presence of children without addressing conditions. Age limits were discussed. Hours adjusted modestly. These changes left the core structure intact. Children continued to work in environments designed for productivity rather than development. The refinement of silk remained the priority. The finished garment offered no hint of this labor. Its surface carried no sign of small hands or long hours. Consumers admired the result without imagining the scale of effort required to achieve such consistency. The youth involved remained anonymous, their contribution absorbed into the fabric's value. Thus, child labor became another quiet foundation of elegance. It relied on the assumption that delicacy equaled harmlessness, and that early work built virtue. Silk benefited from this belief, drawing precision from those least able to refuse. The trade's refinement depended on bodies still forming, their endurance taken for granted, their presence carefully overlooked. Compensation in the silk trade was calculated with precision, but never generosity. Wages were measured carefully against time, output, and perceived replaceability. They arrived in small sums that accumulated slowly, often just enough to justify continuation, and never enough to invite refusal. Payment was framed as fair because it was consistent, and consistency was mistaken for justice. Piecework dominated many silk rooms. Payment followed the product, not the hour. Each completed seam, each finished edge, carried a value determined elsewhere and rarely explained. This system rewarded speed while concealing loss. A moment of rest reduced income. A minor error erased effort. The risk of fatigue was absorbed by the worker, not the ledger. Silence supported this arrangement. Questions about rates were discouraged by custom and consequence. To ask too openly risked being labeled difficult or ungrateful. The trade relied on a steady supply of compliant labor, and silence helped ensure it. Those who spoke found themselves offered fewer pieces, shorter terms, or no work at all. The message traveled quickly without being stated. Women and children were especially affected. Their labor was assumed supplemental, even when it was essential. Wages reflected this assumption. Payment was justified as contribution rather than livelihood, regardless of reality. The framing reduced obligation while preserving output. Need did the rest. Time itself became fragmented. Workers counted not hours, but units. This narrowed attention and discouraged reflection. When effort is divided into small tasks, it becomes harder to assess its total worth. Pennies arrived frequently enough to feel tangible, yet too small to accumulate meaningfully. The rhythm kept workers engaged while limiting leverage. Merchants defended the system by pointing to competition and demand. prices fluctuated, margins narrowed. Efficiency was presented as necessity. In this narrative, wages could not rise. Without consequence, the burden of adjustment settled downward onto those least able to absorb it. Silence smoothed the transfer. The absence of negotiation shaped identity. Workers learned to accept terms as fixed. Value was something assigned, not discussed. Over time, this eroded expectation. Low pay became normal. Gratitude replaced entitlement. The workroom rewarded endurance rather than advocacy. This silence extended beyond wages into conditions. Heat, dust, and fatigue were endured quietly because complaint offered little return. Payment arrived regardless, unchanged by discomfort. The calculation did not include strain. The ledger balanced without acknowledging the body. Outside the workroom, the economics of silk appeared different. Prices in shops reflected luxury. Markups suggested abundance. The contrast between retail value and labor compensation remained obscured by distance. Consumers encountered silk as a finished object with a price that implied worth, unaware of how little of that worth traveled backward. Occasional exposure disrupted this balance. Articles mentioned low wages. Reformers cited figures. These moments produced brief attention, then faded. The system absorbed critique by emphasizing improvement elsewhere or inevitability. Silence resumed its work. Pay measured in pennies trained patience. It encouraged acceptance and discouraged interruption. The smallness of each sum made resistance seem disproportionate. Why object over so little? Why risk stability for principle? The calculation favored quiet continuation. Thus, silk moved through hands compensated just enough to persist and never enough to protest. The trade depended on this narrow margin. Silence was not enforced by rule, but cultivated by design. In the absence of speech, the pennies kept coming, and the work continued. Silk did not merely demand precision, it demanded haste. As the Gilded Age accelerated, fashion learned to mirror the tempo of commerce itself. Seasons shortened, styles shifted more quickly. What had once changed gradually now turned with urgency. Silk, prized for its responsiveness to trend and novelty, became a fabric shaped as much by time as by touch. This pressure filtered downward. Designers and merchants set schedules that left little room for delay. New silhouettes required immediate execution. Colors had to match current taste precisely. Orders arrived with deadlines that assumed compliance rather than negotiation. The workroom absorbed this urgency without ceremony. Speed became expectation, not exception. The need for rapid production altered the rhythm of labor. Tasks were compressed, breaks shortened, errors tolerated less. The careful pace once associated with fine textile work gave way to relentless repetition. Precision remained mandatory, but it had to coexist with urgency. This combination strained bodies and attention alike. Silk responded poorly to haste, which made the demand all the more exacting. Rushed handling increased the risk of damage. Repairs consumed time already scarce. Workers compensated by tightening focus and extending hours. Fatigue was managed privately. The schedule did not adjust. This acceleration affected planning as well as execution. Materials arrived in bulk, processed quickly, and moved onward without pause. There was little opportunity to assess conditions or reconsider methods. The emphasis remained on output. Reflection was a luxury the system could not afford. Fashion's reliance on novelty intensified this cycle. Consumers expected distinction, and distinction depended on change. Silk provided variety through color, texture, and cut, making it ideal for rapid variation. Each shift required new patterns and techniques, learned on the move. Training occurred in real time, errors corrected under pressure. Workers felt this instability keenly. Skills developed over years could become obsolete within a season. Adaptability replaced mastery as the primary requirement. Those who could not adjust quickly enough risked displacement. Speed became a measure of worth. The rhetoric surrounding this pace emphasized progress. Faster production was framed as innovation. Efficiency was celebrated. The cost to labor was rarely included in these narratives. Urgency was treated as neutral, even beneficial. The strain it produced remained invisible outside the room. This acceleration also narrowed margins for care. Health considerations, already secondary, fell further behind. Ventilation, rest, and safety slowed production. They were postponed or minimized. The body was expected to keep pace with demand. When it failed, replacement followed. Fashion's need for speed extended into distribution and display. Shop windows refreshed frequently. Advertisements promised immediacy. Silk garments moved quickly from workroom to showroom, reinforcing the illusion of effortless abundance. The speed of appearance concealed the intensity of production. Over time, urgency became normal. Workers adjusted expectations downward, accepting pace as fixed. Resistance weakened in the face of constant change. The system benefited from this adaptation. When speed becomes routine, questioning it feels impractical. Thus, silk became entangled with time itself. Its elegance masked a relentless schedule that valued responsiveness over sustainability. Fashion demanded motion without pause, novelty without rest. The fabric met this demand through the endurance of those who handled it. Their labor accelerated to match the market's tempo. In this way, the sheen admired in public depended not only on skill, but on speed. The Gilded Age learned to dress itself quickly, and silk bore the mark of that urgency quietly. Woven into every hurried seam, silk appeared pristine, and that appearance suggested a world untouched by labor or hardship. Shops displayed garments as objects of beauty, and the work that produced them was imagined to be equally orderly. This perception created the myth of clean industry, a belief that elegance emerged from spaces where dust, strain, and hazard were absent. In reality, the rooms where silk was prepared were anything but immaculate. Workrooms were structured for efficiency rather than hygiene. Tables were crowded with fabric, tools, and supplies. Threads accumulated along edges and floors. Steam and heat rose continuously from pressing irons and vats. Fine particles of silk and chemical residue remained suspended in the air. The environment was functional, but it was not sanitary. Cleanliness was a matter of optics, not reality. The myth relied on selective visibility. Supervisors, merchants, and visitors saw only portions of the room that could be controlled. Surfaces were wiped, floors swept, and garments staged. Any disruption of the illusion was removed. Workers themselves adapted to the constraints, maintaining composure despite discomfort. The room's disorder became a background that did not enter polite consideration. Chemical treatments added another layer of complexity. Dyes, mordants, and finishing agents coated fabric and lingered in the air. Exposure was continuous, yet invisible. Respiratory irritation, skin sensitivity, and fatigue went unremarked upon in public discourse. The myth of cleanliness erased these realities, creating a sense that silk's refinement required no compromise. Child labor and the presence of small hands contributed to the illusion. Their work appeared delicate and light, reinforcing the idea that silk production was gentle. Observers could not see the repetition, strain, or cumulative effect on developing bodies. The careful handling of fragile fabric suggested care rather than endurance. Myth and perception intertwined. Supervision reinforced the narrative. Inspectors or managers emphasized output and presentation, not conditions. Workers were directed to maintain neatness in visible areas while the room continued to accumulate dust and residue elsewhere. Cleanliness was localized to the surface that mattered for inspection or display. The unseen remained unseen, supporting the myth. the myth of clean industry extended beyond the workroom. Merchants and fashion writers described silk as pure, hygienic, and refined. Advertising emphasized shine and softness, implying that the material itself was inherently untroubled. Consumers rarely questioned this narrative. Distance, both physical and social, protected the illusion. Production was invisible, and consequence hidden. This perception shaped behavior. Workers internalized expectations, managing strain quietly. Complaints were discouraged, not by decree but by social pressure. The myth created a system in which endurance replaced protest. The labor of sustaining appearance became invisible, even to those who performed it. Even occasional mishaps were reframed. Spills, burns, or chemical irritation were treated as personal fault rather than systemic issue. The narrative of cleanliness persisted because the effects were subtle and diffused. Society preferred this understanding because it aligned with admiration for silk rather than scrutiny of the process. Thus, the myth of clean industry protected multiple interests. It shielded consumers from knowledge, preserved merchant reputations, and disciplined workers into silent endurance. Silk moved from workroom to drawing room, appearing untouched, polished, and natural. Beneath that surface, labor persisted in its own rhythm, unnoticed and unacknowledged. Elegance depended on the maintenance of this illusion, and the myth ensured it remained intact. Not all consequences were visible to the casual observer. Silk left marks that could not be photographed, displayed, or neatly folded. Invisible injuries accumulated slowly, often without immediate recognition. They appeared in the lungs, in joints, in muscles fatigued beyond casual endurance. They were the quiet testimony of labor that the world preferred not to see. Repetitive motion shaped the body over time. Hands moved the same pattern repeatedly. Fingers flexed in precise sequences. Wrists and elbows were strained subtly yet persistently. Shoulders hunched to protect the fabric from imperfection. Over weeks and months, these patterns produced discomfort that gradually became chronic. The body learned to compensate, but it paid a cost that silk never revealed. Respiratory effects were similarly hidden. Dust and chemical residues lingered in the air, inhaled steadily across hours. The impact was gradual. Shortness of breath, mild irritation, and cough emerged slowly, appearing innocuous or temporary. Yet these symptoms accumulated, embedding themselves in the body's function, reducing stamina and increasing vulnerability to illness. The air of the workroom was silently exacting. Fatigue worked invisibly as well. The long hours demanded by fashion's need for speed left no outward mark. The body, trained for composure, concealed exhaustion beneath posture, expression, and movement. Pain was tolerated silently because display was prohibited, and to acknowledge suffering was to invite scrutiny, delay, or replacement. Invisible injuries required endurance as much as skill. Children experienced these effects disproportionately. Their developing bodies adapted to labor in ways that were difficult to detect immediately. Tiny muscles tightened, joints overextended, lungs strained. Early exposure created subtle patterns of vulnerability that would only be recognized years later. Yet the demands of production left no room for reflection or mitigation. The invisibility of these injuries reinforced social narratives. Observers praised skill and elegance without recognizing cost. Consumers admired garments, unaware of the strain required to produce them. Merchants maintained schedules and expectations, encouraged by the absence of visible harm. The system thrived on what could not be seen. Documentation of these effects was rare. Medical journals occasionally noted irritation, fatigue, or respiratory complaints. Investigators reported patterns of discomfort among laborers. Yet, these observations were sporadic and often framed as minor inconveniences rather than systemic conditions. Evidence of harm was scattered, dispersed, and easy to ignore. Workers themselves developed coping mechanisms, breathing patterns adjusted, posture modified, muscles conditioned. Pain became familiar and therefore tolerable. The body adapted silently, learning to function within constraints that were neither recognized nor acknowledged. Each adaptation reinforced the fabric's authority, teaching obedience without explicit command. Even when injuries produced more serious outcomes, they were often rationalized. The delicacy of the trade, the gendered assumptions of skill, and the novelty of the material all served to explain discomfort as inevitable. Harm became a private matter, integrated into the rhythm of labor rather than the narrative of consequence. Thus, silk produced elegance at a cost that remained largely hidden. Invisible injuries sustained the polished surface while remaining absent from view. They shaped bodies quietly, trained endurance silently, and reinforced the mythology of refinement. Society admired the result without perceiving the toll, and in this way, the fabric's authority extended far beyond its physical threads into the very pattern of life it concealed. Silk was admired for its beauty, but it owed that admiration to a collective forgetting. Society chose to remember the shine, the drape, and the way it caught the light. It chose not to remember the conditions that produced it. Respectability required this selective memory. The threads of elegance were entwined with what was unseen, and to acknowledge the cost would have unsettled the very notion of refinement. The forgetting was deliberate, though rarely acknowledged as such. Conversations about fashion focused on surface, taste, and presentation. Observers praised color, cut, and movement, assuming that quality and morality were synonymous. What lay behind the seams, in the dust of workrooms, in the repetitive strain of labor, was conveniently ignored. To notice these details would have disrupted social equilibrium. This amnesia extended to laborers themselves. Women, children, and apprentices absorbed expectation quietly. The workroom demanded endurance, yet admiration outside it was afforded to the finished product. Pain and fatigue were private, absorbed into the routine of production. The worker's memory of discomfort remained theirs alone, hidden beneath gloves, skirts, and calm expression. Their stories did not travel beyond walls. The institutions of trade reinforced this forgetting. Merchants, designers, and retailers cultivated an image of effortless refinement. Marketing emphasized origin, luxury, and taste, never exposure or hazard. Annual exhibitions and fashion shows highlighted elegance, not labor. Even charitable campaigns focused on output rather than environment. By shaping public perception, the industry ensured that the price paid in sweat and small injury remained abstract, minimized, or invisible. Families participated in this amnesia through aspiration. Children were trained to admire rather than investigate, to associate wealth with virtue and refinement with ease. Mothers instructed daughters in comportment, teaching them to value appearance over inquiry. Knowledge of process was considered unnecessary or even improper. The lesson was clear. Elegance must be taken at face value. Medical observers occasionally attempted to pierce the veil. Reports documented irritation, fatigue, and respiratory strain. Inspectors noted cramped spaces, heat, and chemical exposure. These observations, however, were rarely published for general attention. When they were acknowledged, they were framed as minor or exceptional. Their implications softened. Society's selective memory preserved comfort for the observer at the expense of the worker. Even accidents were integrated into the myth. Burns, fainting, and repetitive strain were rationalized as isolated, natural, or amusing. The narrative emphasized continuity and progress, not harm or interruption. The public was invited to admire endurance as character, not to recognize its cost. Forgetting became socially reinforced, a form of participation in elegance. Time itself aided the amnesia. By the time silk reached drawing rooms, weeks or months of labor had passed. Heat, dust, and strain had dissipated, leaving only smooth folds and polished shine. Distance, both chronological and physical, separated cause from effect. The fabric appeared unburdened, and the labor that sustained it was easily overlooked. Respectability relied on this omission. By forgetting what was necessary to sustain silk's elegance, society preserved its sense of order. Beauty was safe to admire, labor was safe to ignore. The collective memory was shaped to favor appearance, maintaining a social equilibrium that validated privilege while concealing cost. Thus, convenience of memory became part of silk's design. It ensured that the admiration it commanded did not confront reality. Elegance remained intact because society agreed, whether consciously or unconsciously, to forget. The fabric's authority rested not only on its physical sheen, but on the delicate amnesia that sustained it, even in an age that prized appearances above all. Some observers could not ignore the effects of silk on those who labored with it. Physicians recorded symptoms that escaped the notice of employers and society alike. These were quiet observations, often confined to private notes and cautious reports, but they revealed a pattern that contradicted the polished surface admired in parlors and shops. The fabric's elegance had a shadow, and the body recorded it in ways that could not be concealed. Doctors noted the slow onset of respiratory irritation. Workers presented with mild coughs, persistent dryness of the throat, and a weariness that seemed disproportionate to their tasks. On examination, subtle signs of exposure to fine fibers, chemical treatments, and dust were present. Lungs occasionally bore traces of inflammation, a testimony to inhalation of particles released in the workrooms. These observations were not dramatic, yet they were consistent, appearing across locations and years. Musculoskeletal effects were equally apparent. Hands, wrists, and shoulders exhibited stiffness and strain, especially in those who had labored for long hours. Children and adolescents, whose development was ongoing, showed signs of adaptation to repetitive motion that would carry consequences into adulthood. The alignment required to handle silk precisely imposed tension on the body that accumulated imperceptibly, leaving little visible evidence at first glance. Some physicians attempted to connect these symptoms to conditions of employment. Workrooms were described as warm, dusty, and crowded. Steam and chemical residues were noted as irritants. The repetitive nature of the labor compounded fatigue and contributed to minor injuries. The medical commentary suggested that the elegance presented in public relied on endurance that was neither neutral nor without cost. Society, however, was resistant to these findings. Observers in drawing rooms and boutiques were invested in the illusion of effortless refinement. The reports of doctors were distant, technical, and unadorned by narrative. They conflicted with the visual evidence of finished silk, with its sheen and softness. Concern could be acknowledged only abstractly, never allowed to intrude upon admiration. The result was a partial hearing, where the pattern was recognized but never acted upon. Workers themselves internalized the tension between observation and expectation. They were aware that physicians noted fatigue, respiratory strain, and subtle injury. Yet the praise for composure and precision outside the workroom encouraged concealment. Complaints were rarely rewarded. Discretion became a form of self-preservation. The medical record became both evidence and unacknowledged companion, a quiet acknowledgement of the labor hidden beneath surface. Even when public health advocates referenced these conditions, their efforts were limited by social and economic pressures. Employers emphasized efficiency and profit, while consumers were encouraged to admire the product without inquiry. Regulations were sporadic and enforcement inconsistent. The subtlety of the injuries allowed them to persist, their presence known to few and acted upon by fewer. In this way, doctors who noticed the pattern became chroniclers of endurance rather than agents of reform. Their observations recorded the human cost, yet the society that consumed silk largely ignored it. Elegance remained untarnished by awareness, while bodies bore the quiet consequences of production. Silk thus maintained its authority, in part, because the human experience it shaped was observed but not amplified. Medical recognition existed alongside social amnesia, creating a tension that permitted admiration without accountability. The pattern of strain, fatigue, and exposure persisted invisibly, acknowledged only in hushed notes and cautious consultations, while the polished fabric moved forward into the light. Reports of silk's hidden costs existed, yet they rarely reached the public in full. Journalists, tasked with informing society, often skirted the realities that lay beneath the fabric's sheen. Their articles highlighted novelty, fashion trends, and the refinement of the finished garment, while the toil and endurance of those who produced it were softened, minimized, or omitted entirely. The truth was inconvenient, and the public preferred the illusion. Newspapers and periodicals described silk in glowing terms. Writers praised the quality of imported fabric, the elegance of its drape, and the skill of the dressmakers and tailors who transformed it into gowns and accessories. They celebrated the latest styles, often illustrating them with engravings or detailed descriptions. The labor that created these effects was referenced, if at all, only in abstract, generalized terms. Stories of hardship or fatigue were peripheral, tucked into the margins where few would notice. This avoidance was deliberate. The readership was invested in beauty and social performance, not in the sweat and endurance behind it. A narrative of suffering conflicted with the pleasure of admiration. Editors, aware of these sensibilities, guided coverage accordingly. Facts that might disrupt the fantasy were softened or redirected. The fabric remained a symbol of refinement, unmarred by human cost. Journalists also relied on sources who themselves were intermediaries, often designers, merchants, or showroom managers. These voices emphasized appearance, quality, and reputation. The conditions of workrooms were framed as necessary discipline, inherent to any industry, and rarely as harm. By amplifying these perspectives, writers shaped a narrative that celebrated finish rather than process. When investigative accounts surfaced, they were cautious and constrained. Exposés mentioned heat, dust, or repetitive labor, but the tone remained polite, measured, and deferential. Sensational language was avoided, both to preserve decorum and to maintain access. Stories acknowledged that labor could be arduous without suggesting culpability or systemic failure. Readers were encouraged to recognize difficulty abstractly while continuing to admire outcomes. The omission of detail extended to the youngest and most vulnerable workers. Child labor was noted in passing, if mentioned at all, and often framed as instruction or preparation for adulthood. Small hands were praised for delicacy, never for endurance. The contrast between admiration for skill and disregard for strain reinforced the myth that elegance required no cost. This selective reporting shaped public perception. Society absorbed the narrative of silk as a product of refinement and culture rather than a consequence of labor. Consumers, shielded from reality, admired beauty and novelty, while the human effort behind it remained peripheral. The fabric's authority depended in part on this careful mediation. Even when accidents or illness occurred, they were rarely linked to silk in public discourse. Newspapers recorded incidents, but commentary shifted to lessons in caution, personal responsibility, or anecdotal misfortune. Patterns of strain or exposure were overlooked. The workroom's hidden realities persisted, obscured by narrative choices that favored elegance over truth. Thus, journalists writing around the truth maintained the illusion of silk's effortless beauty. They chronicled style and success while ignoring endurance and exposure. In their hands, information became a tool to protect perception, not to confront reality. The fabric moved from workshop to window untouched, its labor shielded from collective attention, and society continued to admire without inquiring too deeply, silk production attracted attention not only for its elegance, but also for the human effort required to sustain it. Philanthropists occasionally observed the conditions of labor, raising concern for the well-being of workers, yet their interventions were limited, selective, and often decorative. The generosity that was visible to society rarely translated into substantive reform. Charity softened perception, but left structure intact. Organizations and individuals sponsored reading rooms, dining halls, and modest aid for those employed in silk workrooms. They praised diligence and endurance and offered assistance framed as improvement or relief. Meals were provided, clothing repaired, and modest stipends distributed. These gestures were applauded publicly, celebrated as evidence of concern and virtue. They reassured patrons and society that the industry was not neglectful. Yet these measures rarely addressed the root conditions. Long hours, heat, dust, and repetitive motion continued unchanged. Wages remained low, ventilation poor, and chemical exposure ongoing. Philanthropy provided comfort, but did not alter expectation. The underlying labor practices that created silk's elegance persisted. Small reliefs acted as masks, preserving the appearance of concern while leaving systemic pressures untouched. The selective nature of this aid reinforced social hierarchies. Those in positions of influence determined what forms of assistance were visible and which remained private. Assistance often emphasized moral instruction rather than material improvement. Young women received lessons in comportment alongside meals. Children were taught discipline as a form of care. Effort was framed as virtue and endurance as character. The labor itself was not questioned. Public acknowledgement reinforced this dynamic. Reports of charitable work highlighted generosity while avoiding scrutiny of the workrooms. Newsletters and periodicals praised the provision of books, lectures, and comfortable spaces. Images illustrated smiling recipients rather than conditions endured. Silk appeared in shops and parlors as polished and perfect, and the gestures of aid were interpreted as evidence that all was well. Workers, for their part, learned to navigate this attention carefully. Visible gratitude was expected. Participation in organized charity became another form of social labor, layered atop production responsibilities. Complaints about hours or exposure risked being interpreted as ingratitude, undermining both safety and favor. The boundaries of intervention were clearly delineated: benefit without questioning, assistance without challenge. Even reform-minded philanthropists were constrained by social expectation. To critique the system too directly risked alienation from peers and patrons. Intervention required tact, charm, and subtlety. Practical remedies for working conditions were often deferred or softened. Comfort was provided in ways that could be observed and praised, rather than in ways that could disrupt the production or perception of silk. Philanthropy without reform created a cycle. Society admired concern. Workers received small relief. The fabric moved onward, polished and untarnished. The visible acts of generosity reassured consumers, designers, and employers that labor was acknowledged without requiring meaningful change. Elegance remained untouchable, protected by gestures that were both real and limited. Thus, charity became a tool for social equilibrium rather than a mechanism for justice. Silk benefited from this arrangement. The labor that sustained it continued largely unseen, its demands uninterrupted. Philanthropy softened perception, preserved image, and allowed beauty to circulate without confronting its hidden cost. In this way, care existed, but reform did not, and silk's authority remained secure. Silk's journey from workroom to wardrobe depended on separation. Consumers admired the final product, often without considering the steps it had passed through. This distance was both physical and conceptual. Shops, salons, and drawing rooms presented silk polished and perfect, free of dust, fatigue, or evidence of labor. The people who created it were invisible, their presence abstracted into an aura of refinement that surrounded the fabric itself. Distance began in production. Workrooms were located above shops, behind unmarked doors, or in districts removed from the drawing rooms that would display silk. By the time a garment reached a customer, it had traveled through many hands and stages, each adding labor and potential strain. The further it traveled, the less the end consumer needed to imagine these interventions. Silk arrived intact, suggesting that its elegance was inherent rather than achieved. This separation encouraged a particular kind of perception. Consumers focused on surface qualities. The smoothness of the weave, the richness of color, and the movement of the fabric across the body. These elements could be assessed visually and tactilely without invoking thought about the labor required. Admiration was immediate and uncomplicated, reinforcing the impression that refinement was effortless. Economic distance reinforced this perception. Silk was expensive, and its price implied value and legitimacy. The cost of labor and material was consolidated into a single sum, concealing the small wages, long hours, and repetitive tasks that sustained production. The consumer paid for final elegance, not for endurance or exposure, and the separation of cost from process allowed aesthetic pleasure to remain untroubled. This gentle distance shaped social interaction as well. Patrons praised elegance in company, discussed texture and cut, and compared color or style. The discussion never extended to production conditions. To inquire was to risk social awkwardness, to disrupt the shared experience of appreciation. Distance made moral or practical questions seem irrelevant. The consumer's gaze remained polite and undistracted, focused on surface and sensation. Distance also moderated awareness of harm. Any discomfort endured during production was abstract, invisible, and easily minimized. Dust, heat, chemical residues, and strain were confined to the workroom and the bodies of laborers. The consumer encountered only the product, which carried no indication of process. Absence of evidence became tacit proof that all had been accomplished smoothly. Over time, this separation reinforced expectations of elegance as intrinsic rather than contingent. Silk appeared naturally refined, its polish suggesting innate perfection. Consumers learned to value effect without considering effort. The labor that sustained luxury remained peripheral, almost mythic. Its invisibility became part of silk's appeal. The gentle distance between production and consumption also reinforced hierarchy. Those able to pay for silk experienced it as a gift of refinement. Those who produced it bore labor without recognition. The separation allowed admiration to circulate upward, while cost and strain circulated quietly downward. Social and physical distance were mutually reinforcing. Thus, the consumer's gentle distance ensured that silk could exist as a symbol rather than a record. It allowed society to appreciate beauty while avoiding acknowledgement of endurance. Elegance traveled to drawing rooms intact, appearing unburdened and serene. The labor that created it remained quietly confined to rooms far removed, sustaining the illusion that refinement was effortless, permanent, and complete. Despite careful concealment, the hidden costs of silk occasionally manifested in ways too dramatic to ignore. Fires, collapses, and accidents erupted unexpectedly, revealing the fragile line between refinement and catastrophe. Workrooms, crowded and heated, could become dangerous in moments. Heat, dust, and chemical exposure combined with flammable fabrics to create conditions in which disaster waited quietly, unseen until it struck. A small spark could ignite yards of silk, threads and linings feeding flames almost invisibly until they surged suddenly. Workers had little time to react, and escape routes were often narrow, congested, or inadequately marked. The fire's arrival transformed the laborious patience of hours into instant peril. Efforts to save materials or tools were secondary to the necessity of survival. Calm composure became a matter of life and death. Collapses of shelving, stacks of fabric, or temporary structures were equally alarming. Rooms dense with silk, tools, and supplies could yield unpredictably under weight or movement. The sound of falling timber or cascading cloth startled the body and interrupted the delicate rhythm of production. Injuries were often minor but cumulative, reinforcing fatigue and strain. Yet even small accidents carried social consequences, as they highlighted the physical demands previously invisible to polite society. Public shock followed quickly when such events reached notice. Reports in newspapers, often framed in sensational terms, described flames licking through workrooms, children rescued from debris, or workers injured in the rush to safety. For the wider society, these incidents punctured the illusion of silk as effortless and pristine. Patrons who admired garments were momentarily confronted with the human effort behind the beauty they consumed. The contrast between admiration and reality was stark. Despite alarm, reform was rarely immediate. Managers and proprietors emphasized continuity, repair, and containment. Production resumed as quickly as possible, and safety measures were adjusted only insofar as they maintained efficiency and reduced liability. The underlying system remained largely unchanged. The spectacle of disaster reassured some that oversight existed, even when its effect on labor conditions was minimal. Workers absorbed both the physical and emotional aftermath. Those who survived closely monitored conditions, noting vulnerabilities while continuing to labor. Trauma was internalized, and narratives of survival reinforced a culture of quiet endurance. Fear became another layer of control, shaping behavior without the need for direct supervision. The workroom remained a space of discipline, moderated by the constant presence of risk. The dramatic nature of such events also served to distance observers further. Patrons and consumers were reassured that fires or collapses were rare exceptions, isolated from the normal rhythm of silk production. The majority of labor continued invisibly and uninterrupted, reinforcing the perception that elegance typically emerged unscathed. Spectacle functioned as a diversion rather than a call to sustained reflection. In the aftermath, silk garments themselves remained untarnished, carried forward to showrooms and drawing rooms without evidence of danger. Their polished surface continued to command admiration, while the labor and risk required to sustain it remained confined to memory and report. Public shock highlighted cost, but did not alter consumption. Thus, fire, collapse, and alarm reminded society of silk's hidden perils, while leaving the fabric's authority intact. Beauty persisted, admired as ever, sustained by labor, made perilous, yet largely invisible. The occasional disaster punctuated the myth of effortless refinement, yet did little to change the underlying conditions that allowed silk to maintain its perfection. Voices occasionally rose to question the conditions behind silk's brilliance, yet they were often confined to the edges of discourse. Fashion reformers observed the strain, fatigue, and hazard that sustained elegance and spoke cautiously of change. Their influence was limited by social expectation, economic pressure, and the pervasive belief that beauty justified endurance. Reform existed, but only at the margins, where it could be noted without threatening the dominant narrative. Reformers drew attention to excessive hours, inadequate ventilation, and repetitive labor. They described heat, dust, and chemical exposure in measured language, highlighting the slow accumulation of harm. Reports included recommendations for improved conditions, adjusted schedules, and the education of young workers. Yet these efforts were frequently framed as guidance or moral persuasion rather than enforcement, reflecting the delicate balance between concern and propriety. The reformers themselves were constrained by perception. Those in positions of influence needed tact. Criticism too direct could alienate patrons or merchants, diminish credibility, and reduce opportunity for further advocacy. Advice had to be couched in language of care, civility, and social responsibility. Reformers appealed to conscience rather than power, and subtlety became the instrument of their work. Economic structures complicated change. Silk production relied on speed, precision, and predictability. Adjustments that slowed output or increased cost met resistance. Owners and merchants framed reform measures as potential threats to quality and profitability. Reformers found themselves negotiating with both ideals of welfare and the practical demands of business, often resulting in compromises that left core conditions intact. The spatial arrangement of workrooms reinforced the limitations of reform. Conditions were hidden by design, insulated from observation. Supervisors could implement minor adjustments, but fundamental hazards remained obscured. The separation between production and display allowed reform to proceed without disrupting the polished image of silk. The fabric's surface continued to convey refinement, while the workrooms remained largely unchanged. Even sympathetic media attention rarely translated into broad action. Articles and essays highlighted the plight of workers and praised reform initiatives, yet few measures were universally adopted. Society admired the intentions of advocates, but continued to consume luxury as usual. The narrative of elegance remained intact, supported by selective visibility and consumer desire for beauty without consideration of cost. Reformers also relied on moral framing. They appealed to ideals of duty, humanity, and social improvement. Complaints were often reframed as opportunities to elevate both labor and industry. Yet these arguments required acceptance by those with authority, and the latitude for intervention remained constrained. Effective change was slow, incremental, and dependent on goodwill rather than mandate. Workers themselves were influenced indirectly. Awareness of potential oversight encouraged cautious adherence to expectations. Small improvements, such as brief breaks or better lighting, were welcomed. But they did not fundamentally alter the demands of production. Endurance remained central, and the cultivation of elegance continued to dictate movement, posture, and attention. Thus, fashion reformers operated at the edges of power, noting injustice without dismantling it. Their presence reminded society that silk's beauty was not entirely costless, yet the structure that sustained it remained largely protected. Elegance continued to move through parlors and shops undisturbed, its authority preserved by the marginal nature of intervention, while the labor that enabled it persisted quietly, disciplined, and largely invisible. Silk, in its delicate perfection, could defend itself only in appearance. The fabric shimmered and flowed, catching light and drawing admiration. Yet it had no agency, no voice, and no ability to protect the labor that produced it. Its elegance existed as a shield for perception, masking endurance, strain, and hazard. In this way, silk became a symbol of power that it could never wield. The garment presented itself as flawless. Seams were tight, folds graceful, and color uniform. Each element spoke of care and refinement. Observers interpreted these qualities as evidence of skill and order. Yet the silk could not acknowledge the conditions required to achieve such polish. It remained silent, dependent on the invisibility of the processes that shaped it. Labor bore the burden. Women, children, and apprentices performed precise and repetitive movements, navigating heat, dust, and chemical exposure without pause. Their endurance sustained the fabric's surface, yet they were rarely recognized. Silk itself moved freely through society, shielded from inquiry, admired without understanding. Its beauty was inseparable from the sacrifice it obscured. This lack of defense extended to safety. Silk caught fire, frayed under strain, and responded unpredictably to moisture and handling. It relied on the vigilance of those who managed it. Workers adjusted, pressed, and monitored, anticipating its reactions and protecting it from damage. The fabric depended entirely on human care to preserve its perfection, yet retained authority in the eyes of observers. Luxury amplified this effect. Consumers encountered silk in shops and salons, removed from workrooms and hazards. Price suggested value and refinement. Presentation suggested ease and leisure. The garment appeared to assert its own worth, yet the authority it commanded rested on the hidden endurance of others. Silk could never protect those who produced it, yet society assumed that beauty existed without cost. Even when mishap occurred, silk's defense remained aesthetic rather than practical. A torn seam or blemished surface was repaired carefully to maintain outward perfection. The visual impression mattered more than the story of effort or exposure. Society praised the finished garment, rarely questioning the circumstances that created it. Silk's authority depended on the maintenance of this perception. The symbolic power of silk was reinforced by distance. Imported fabrics arrived polished and finished, suggesting inherent quality. Workrooms were removed from display, labor rendered invisible. The farther removed the labor, the more convincing the illusion that elegance was effortless. Silk, as a medium, relied on social complicity to defend its reputation. Workers internalized this dynamic. They learned that their care maintained both fabric and authority. Errors or visible fatigue threatened the perception of perfection, not only for themselves, but for the garment itself. The silk became a silent taskmaster, shaping behavior through expectation rather than instruction. Luxury that could not defend itself depended on the endurance and discretion of others. Its authority rested on appearance, its protection on the invisibility of labor. Society admired silk, celebrated its beauty, and attributed to it qualities it could not possess. Meanwhile, the work required to sustain this illusion continued, disciplined, quiet, and largely unacknowledged. Silk, perfect and untouchable in the public eye, moved through the world secure in appearance, yet powerless to shield the reality of its creation. Silk arrived in the Gilded Age as a promise of purity and refinement, yet its journey through human hands slowly altered that perception. The fabric's innocence, celebrated in drawing rooms and display cases, was quietly eroded by the realities of production. Each step in its creation left traces invisible to the eye, but tangible to those who labored. Over time, the association of silk with effortless beauty became more complex, tinged with compromise and endurance. The transformation began in the workrooms. Raw fibers were sorted, combed, and twisted into threads under conditions that tested stamina and patience. Chemical treatments prepared the material for dyeing and finishing. Heat and steam shaped its texture and sheen. Each intervention added precision, but also exposure. Laborers bent to tasks that demanded repetition and vigilance, their bodies absorbing strain silently. The more silk passed through these processes, the more it carried the imprint of human endurance. As the fabric moved toward completion, the contrast between its surface and its making became more pronounced. Shoppers and patrons saw only the finished product, smooth, luminous, and seemingly untouched by labor. They were unaware of dust-laden air, chemical residues, burns, or fatigue endured to achieve perfection. The invisibility of process protected silk's reputation, yet it also highlighted the disparity between appearance and reality. Innocence was sustained in the public eye, while it was eroded behind closed doors. The gradual loss of innocence was further compounded by scale and speed. Industrial demand increased pressure on both materials and laborers. Seasonal trends required faster production, new colors, and constant renewal of styles. What had once been crafted slowly with attention to detail now required urgency and repetition. The fabric's polish depended increasingly on human effort that went unacknowledged. With each passing season, The narrative of silk as untouched, luxury became more strained. Child labor, long hours, and the toll of chemical exposure made the price of beauty undeniable to those in the rooms of creation. Injuries accumulated, respiratory irritation persisted, and bodies adapted to strain as a matter of survival. Yet these realities rarely emerged in public consciousness. Instead, they quietly reshaped the meaning of silk. Its sheen no longer signaled mere elegance, it carried the weight of compromise. Philanthropy and reform attempted to intervene, yet their efforts were limited. Small comforts, education, or advocacy softened hardship, but did not eliminate it. The work persisted, and the fabric continued its journey toward display, polished and perfect. Each act of endurance further eroded the illusion of innocence, even as society clung to it. Luxury relied on this duality. Silk needed to appear pure and effortless, while depending on labor, that was neither. The contrast between admiration and knowledge created tension, subtle but pervasive. Those who wore silk benefited from its surface, protected by the concealment of its making. Its beauty remained unchallenged, yet the story of its creation grew more intricate with every passing year. Thus, silk's innocence was a careful fiction, preserved by distance, concealment, and social agreement. The fabric could not defend itself. It relied on labor, discretion, and the selective gaze of society. Over time, the sheen that had once suggested untouched elegance became a symbol of endurance and hidden cost. Silk remained beautiful, yet its perfection carried the quiet echo of compromise, a truth invisible to all but the hands that shaped it. Despite fires, reforms, and shifting attention, certain truths about silk persisted. The fabric continued to embody elegance, to signal refinement, and to demand endurance from those who produced it. The shine remained untarnished, the drape graceful, and the social authority of silk undiminished. What remained unchanged was not merely its appearance, but the system of labor and expectation that sustained it. Workrooms retained their structure and rhythm, tables crowded with threads and fabric, the constant heat from irons and steaming devices, and the fine particles that lingered in the air continued as they always had. Women and children bent over the cloth, performing repetitive tasks with precision and care. The schedule demanded consistency, speed, and attention. The body adapted quietly, learning endurance as a necessity. The social separation between production and consumption also remained. Finished silk traveled through layers of oversight, transport, and presentation before, reaching drawing rooms and boutiques. By the time it arrived, all evidence of labor was absent. Patrons admired color, sheen, and cut, without awareness of heat, dust, chemical air, or repetitive strain. Elegance continued to mask effort, and admiration flowed uninterrupted. Consumer behavior reinforced continuity. Demand for novelty, style, and perfection persisted, driving the same expectations of speed, precision, and flawless finish. Shops displayed silk as if it existed naturally in that state, hiding both the journey and the toil behind it. Observers assumed elegance to be inherent, reinforcing the system that produced it. Beauty dictated perception, and perception maintained tradition. The authority of silk remained intact. In public and private, it suggested taste, virtue, and refinement. Its smooth surface implied order, care, and attention. Even when glimpses of hardship appeared through fires, illness, or investigative reporting, they were framed as exceptions rather than indicators of systemic change. The fabric retained its role as both object of admiration and instrument of social hierarchy. Laborers continued to navigate expectation as they always had. They monitored movement, posture, and handling to protect the fabric. They endured fatigue, irritation, and exposure without complaint. Their skills, patience, and endurance remained essential, though largely invisible. The hierarchy that elevated silk in public relied entirely on the quiet compliance of these individuals? Patterns of social perception also endured. Consumers, philanthropists, and reformers maintained a careful balance between acknowledgement and omission. Interest in working conditions, exposure, or strain was rare and often limited in scope. Society prioritized polish over process, image over endurance. The myth of effortless elegance persisted, sustained by collective attention and selective memory. Even reform, when attempted, left fundamental conditions intact. Measures for safety, comfort, or labor were often partial, temporary, or symbolic. The rhythm of production continued, guided by speed, precision, and the maintenance of appearance. The essential relationship between silk, labor, and admiration remained unchanged, reinforcing the authority of the fabric. In this way, silk continued to perform the same roles it had always occupied. Its surface communicated beauty, refinement, and status. Its production demanded endurance, precision, and silent labor. Social narratives preserved the illusion of effortlessness. Across decades, the sheen endured, the labor persisted, and the rules of observation and admiration remained stable. Silk retained its power because, despite change, the core dynamics of labor, perception, and elegance remained unbroken. Even after decades of admiration, critique, and minor reform, silk continued to speak softly to those who knew how to listen. Its voice was subtle, carried not in sound but in movement, sheen, and touch. The fabric communicated endurance, precision, and human effort through the very qualities that society celebrated. Every fold, every glimmer, and every seamless line whispered of the labor that remained invisible, yet essential to its perfection. Silk moved through rooms with quiet authority. It bent with the body without resisting, draped with an elegance that seemed effortless, and caught light in ways that suggested natural grace. Observers rarely questioned the story behind this appearance, yet each shimmer contained the memory of hours spent pressing, steaming, and handling threads with care. The fabric retained a record of its journey, imperceptible to the eye but evident to the trained touch. The labor it encapsulated was ongoing. Workrooms remained structured, crowded, and warm, filled with the sounds of shears, presses, and quiet concentration. Women and children continued to manage their movements, calibrating speed, pressure, and posture to protect the material. Each action was absorbed into the rhythm of production, translating human endurance into the smooth finish that reached drawing rooms and shops. Silk, though inanimate, carried these efforts as part of its essence. This quiet communication extended beyond the tactile. Silk instructed those who wore it, shaping posture, attention, and movement. Composure became a requirement, restraint a necessity. The fabric demanded awareness without complaint. Those who mastered its language moved with grace, maintaining appearance and prolonging admiration. Every gesture, every adjustment, responded to its subtle cues. Socially, silk maintained its power through perception. Patrons and observers admired color, texture, and sheen, unaware of the labor or risk embedded in the final product. Their gaze reinforced the authority of the fabric, validating endurance and precision while overlooking the human cost. The unspoken exchange between labor, material, and observer sustained a cycle that had persisted for generations. Even accidents and disasters did not fully interrupt this authority. Fires, collapses, or sudden exposure to chemical residues reminded observers of the stakes involved. Yet, the fundamental dynamics remained. Silk continued to arrive in shops and drawing rooms, polished, flawless, and commanding attention. The occasional shock reinforced admiration, highlighting the delicacy and care required without dismantling the overall perception of effortless beauty. Philanthropy and reform, however well-intentioned, had not diminished the fabric's whispered authority. Small improvements in ventilation, brakes, or working conditions were absorbed into the system without altering its essential demands. Silk continued to rely on endurance, discretion, and careful handling, and those who engaged with it learned to respect its quiet expectations. Through all of this, silk persisted as a symbol and a teacher. Its surface conveyed refinement. Its handling demanded discipline. Its presence reinforced social hierarchies while concealing the human effort beneath. Elegance, maintained across decades, was inseparable from endurance and discretion, and the fabric's authority remained unchallenged. Thus, the fabric still whispered. It spoke not in words, but in the shimmer of threads, in the smooth curve of a seam, in the weight felt against skin, and in the careful gestures it required. Silk continued to command admiration while retaining its secrets, preserving the delicate balance between beauty and cost, labor and perception. The story of refinement was ongoing, and the fabric itself remained its quiet, enduring witness.